I thought for today's chat, since I've taken the courses with you, the whole lot, been exploring these few books, Insights in Space, Clean Language, and Metaphors in Mind. I just have a few thoughts, few questions.
Sure.
I'm going to start with the figurative versus metaphorical versus literal. The literal is obviously obvious, it's just whatever is said, it's out there. When it comes to figurative and metaphorical, I don't know if there's also the conceptual thing, the conceptual metaphors. What makes it easy for people to spot the difference? Like in the metaphors that were elicited in Metaphors in Mind, the Clean Language book, there were like series of metaphors, like the ones that we did in the metaphor sessions. And some things were, from what I learned with you in Metaphors of Movement, were very conceptual. Like there's a tap that throws on gold and this gold comes on this person, which was a bit similar to the fulfillments, but it didn't seem so. So how can I start like thinking of the difference between conceptual, figurative, and metaphorical in a much simpler way? Because I think this is one of the most confusing things lots of the Metaphor of Movement attendees.
As concepts go, I'm not entirely sure how important this is. I've only introduced it really in the last 12 months into the metaphors trainings that I do. I've never mentioned it prior to then, mostly because I didn't know it, and it was never an issue. And I was still able to develop lots of stuff, and lots of other people contributed things too, in the absence of those categorical distinctions. So I just want to emphasize it's probably not that important. Now, the other aspect to this is there's probably lots of categories. I just refer to 3. Now, why do I refer to those 3? Because they're the 3 that I understand. I'm not going to pretend for 1 second to be an expert in any of this stuff whatsoever. Essentially, as I learn stuff and I find it to be useful, then I offer it out for other people to do with as they see fit. But there is no way I can profess to have studied the subject deep enough and to have done enough further education or any degree courses or anything like that to have any sort of academic insight and knowledge. There'll be people far better than I. However, with all that said, the 3 distinctions that I refer to when I'm doing the metaphors work. So we've got metaphorical communication, and I know we can categorize metaphorical communication into multiple subcategories too. Please don't ask me what they are, because I don't know. I'd have to actually go and look those up in a reference book. So we've got metaphorical communication. So if
Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Alan Johnson. So I think that's a good reference for the differences.
Yeah, Lakoff's books, whilst I think they're the most unenjoyable read I've ever come across, they're incredibly useful. And I think he's really the benchmark for a lot of this stuff. So Metaphors We Live By is a superb book. I learned a lot from that, and I'd recommend everyone reads that, even if they're not really into their metaphor stuff. So we've got metaphorical communication, literal communication, and figurative. And the easiest ways I have to explain the differences here is that if I'm being metaphorical, then I'm largely going into describing this through the filters of something else. And hopefully there's a relationship between the something else, the metaphor that I'm using, and the thing I'm describing.
So I'm going to interrupt you here for a small second. So here there's the isomorphic metaphor and there's the autogenic metaphor. So isomorphic is more of the lateral thinking, the examples, different stories that are parallel. And
I'm not convinced.
Okay.
So in NLP, they talk about homomorphic, isomorphic, polymorphic, all the different morphics. And I see lots of different people writing different things about those different distinctions. And then when I see them delivering an example of it, I don't see any difference. It's largely, I'm going to tell a story and call it a homomorphic, isomorphic, polymorphic, something morphic metaphor. And actually, they're just telling a story. But is it an isomorphic metaphor? Or is it just a story? And now, what is the difference between a story and a metaphor? When does a story become a metaphor? When does a metaphor become a story? And having been involved in lots of storytelling, not traditions, that would probably be the wrong word, but storytelling is really my thing, is what I do. And I know storytellers, and I know from my sort of background in magic and mysticism and stuff like that, I know storytellers, and they're absolutely superb. They're people that can captivate a room of people as they just tell a story. But most of the stories they tell aren't metaphors. They're stories. The metaphor seems to be something that people project into it, because essentially we can all watch the same story played out in the movie, in a play, in a book, and we project into it different scenarios that relates to in our own experiences and lives. So the story has multiple metaphors for different people, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's metaphorical. The metaphor is something people project into it.
So is it the bits that they take from it, the metaphorical bits that they take from it based on their own experience?
Right, but then some aspects of the story are highly metaphorical.
Which is
even though the metaphor that people derive from the story isn't the one that necessarily the narrator is trying to give. I'll give an example. There's a British band called Block Party, and some people may well be familiar with this band, and Block is just B-L-O-C, Block Party. You won't find this on Spotify, but there's a song they have called 2 More Years. Don't look it up. Don't do anything to find out the background to the song. Just listen to the song. And basically, I think it's a brilliant tune. It's a brilliant song, brilliant lyrics. But what the hell is it about? And I think everyone listening to it finds their own meaning, and it's pertinent to them. So then when I looked it up, and I looked up the discussion threads on what this song actually is about, of course, nobody agrees. And of course, even the fans don't really agree, because they, and it's fascinating to me that, okay, so this song, it's a song telling a story, but what is the story about? That is what the people bring to it. But yet, of course, in the writing of the story, the author of the song had something in mind.
Sure.
But was that conveyed to the listening parties? So when we're dealing with isomorphic, polymorphic, homomorphic, or polymorphics in metaphor telling, what I see happening is most of those storytellers and the trainers, they're usually NLPers, to be fair. Most of those trainers actually don't necessarily, they just claim it's a metaphor. Your unconscious mind knows, and blah, blah, blah. And they basically claim lots of credit for stuff that probably isn't happening. But because it's such a subjective thing, it can't be proven or disproven. There's no scientific basis behind that we can measure against. There's no baseline that we can measure against and prove against. Essentially, a lot of these trainers as storytellers claim a whole bunch of stuff for their metaphor that probably is not happening at all.
So it's stories and autogenic metaphors from your perspective.
Not necessarily, because there's some people they don't project into, they don't project a metaphor into the story. For example, I remember at school, so we were quite young. I mean, we must have been about 5 or 6 years old, being told the classic story of the ugly duckling. And for those unfamiliar, because I don't know how, the younger generations may not be familiar with these stories anymore. Essentially, the ugly duckling gets picked on by all the other ducks, and he grows up, and he's always so ugly. And of course, it turns out he's a beautiful swan. And so, there's beauty in everybody, and we just judge people according. And I remember when that was explained to us by the teacher, and I remember also sitting there thinking, really, you actually feel you need to explain this nonsense to us? Isn't that obvious? And to my amazement, all the children were familiar with the story, but probably only about half the room had ever understood it to be a message. It was now, is that a metaphor? Is that a metaphor? Or is it just a way of teaching a message to young children? But of course, half the room that I was, of all these other kids I was in, had never worked out the message. They had just heard it as a story. So the story had then to be explained to them to be the message it was. And so I don't know how much, if it's just storytelling and autogenic metaphor, because most of the autogenic metaphors that I work with in the metaphors of movement work is elicited from the individual. It's not a story they've ever told before. And the large part of the metaphors of movement work is facilitating the individual to have conscious recognition of the story, because they've never consciously recognized it before. They're living it out. And sure, we know it's a central organizing principle in how they organize their life. So they're living it out. But what they're not doing is articulating it or telling it.
Mm-hmm.
They're often living the negative consequences of it, which is why it's the problem issue that they're raising. So at that point, it's not an autogenic metaphor that the person is telling or projecting in, because they don't even know it's there. The autogenic metaphors that we work with are elicited from the person, and it's new to the person. They're often as surprised by it as anyone else would be.
It's like the fish in water thing. They don't know that they're a metaphor until they're out of it and they're seeing it on the screen or seeing it with a flip chart. Okay. And there tends to be, like in David Gordon's therapeutic metaphors, he tends to insert like the visual, representational system, kinesthetic, auditory, and then submodalities, and then adding. So, and you mentioned that there might be submodalities in metaphor in the higher levels, like level 6, level 7, but they're different inside the autogenic metaphor. Is there a possibility to give us a sneak peek into that?
It's difficult, because in order to in any way make it make sense, I would have to go through a whole bunch of stuff. let me put it like this. So most people who've done NLP, I would hope, will be very familiar with visual and auditory submodalities. Now, how do I even begin to explain this? Okay, dolphins. Now, this is not me using a metaphor to explain something. This is me using an example of interspecies, other species communication patterns. So in case anyone now slips into, oh, he's now telling a metaphor. No, I'm not. Nor am I telling a story. I'm taking a piece from Bateson, which he uses to describe a particular principle. So now dolphins communicate by clicks and whistles. And so we have analog and digital communication between the clicks and the whistles. And so they have a very limited repertoire of what they can do. Now, if the signal itself, as Bateson points out, the signal itself doesn't have to be anything in terms of language. You can have a man standing on a cliff edge waving a flag around, as long as everyone knows what the flag is referring to. And using one man and one flag, you can create a whole alphabet and a whole language just communicated through the flag. Now, dolphins have a very similar proposition going on. They have clicks and whistles, but of course you can have an infinite variety of clicks, of how you group them together, the spacing between them. So it's a digital clicking, but there's analogs between. I'm sorry?
Kind of like the Morse code, but it's
right.
Yeah.
So with Morse code, they've limited it to the alphabet, but of course you could create infinite array of letters. It just starts to get more complicated.
Yeah.
Now, dolphins also have an additional piece. You see, two dolphins like this communicating is going to be a very different proposition to a dolphin and a dolphin communicating. So now approximation and body position, and of course we have distance and elevation, as well as angles. Now people have the same thing. Now, in order for people,
psychogeography, I don't know if you call it the same thing.
Right. So now, if you look at, and again, sorry to go off at tangents here, but if you now look at the PUA communities, basically desperately pathetic men who are going to learn persuasion and influence to try and get laid. Now, whilst I despair at the kind of lifestyle people would actively choose to indulge in and think this is a way of being happy, because I've met a lot of these fellows and I can tell you it doesn't make them happy. And that's why I despair at it, because it's not really going to help them have a better life.
They have a lot of peak states.
Right, but in their desperation to map out the social landscape, they started to notice a lot of stuff that psychology and behaviorists missed. And it's stupid little things like, and when I heard this, I started to adopt it myself, and it's hugely effective. Don't stand square onto an individual when you're talking to them. Angle your body at 45 degrees. Stuff like that. And these are very, very subtle. Very subtle things indeed. And yet they are very, very powerful, and they don't register consciously. And I've completely forgotten what the question was and what the point was I was trying to get to. So do remember.
We were talking about the submodality aspect in metaphor when we got here.
Right. Thank you. So now, what are the submodalities within a metaphor? So Some of them will be expressed within the language, the linguistic distinctions that people have. Like when we talk about a really big problem, it's a small problem. Okay, we have proximal size. It's so close now. I don't know if I can handle it. That kind of stuff is all getting on top. So we've got positional stuff. So these things are largely going into the proprioceptive mode. Now, within the metaphorical landscape or metaphorical domain, of which there's a lot of similarity between what the clean language people are exploring and what we're doing in the metaphors of movement work. The location of stuff, the approximation of stuff, the information density, information distribution within the metaphorical domain is hugely significant. But we match that against the linguistic distinctions. So in the English language, we're able to say that's right. That's something that you best have left. That's the right way to go. So we have very strong left and right distinctions linguistically. And of course, now not everything that's right for me is actually to the right. So now what's the difference between me saying, yeah, that's right, figuratively, that's right, literally, and that's right, metaphorically? In those three different domains. And what we're going to find is those three differences will represent themselves according to position, distance, size, all of those things. So these are largely proprioceptive submodalities rather than visual and auditory submodalities. Much like how dolphins are creating the same relationships in order to communicate with digital communication.
So proprioceptive, to define it, it's how we sense things.
Right. So now, this is, again, I've got to go off on tangent. Oliver Sacks wrote, and I had a really weird synchronicity with Oliver Sacks, the neurologist. He was famous for the book The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which was made into an absolutely terrible film. And he wrote loads and loads of books. I recommend everyone buy everything that Oliver Sacks wrote. Quite a remarkable man. He's got loads of stuff online, lots of videos of him, lots of TV shows. He was a wonderful human being. As an aside, by the way, I got an email from somebody, a friend of mine, who said, Oliver Sacks is in Bristol. It was my friend David, who's over in Bristol. And I was like, cool. I'm going to message him and see if I can get him over to talk at my practice group. Let's just try it. Let's just see. I mean, of course he won't come. And he wrote back. He must have been about 80 years old. And he said, thank you for the invite. I'd love to come, but I'm fully booked for the next 60 years. And it was a great character, a great guy. Now, he wrote in one of his chapters, and I think it was an anthropologist on Mars, about a patient who had lost the sense of proprioception. Through I can't even remember what the mechanism was now, whether it was a brain injury or a disease process. So essentially what this woman...
Is it the same anthropologist who's on the book of Luke Sturz? Because it's an anthropologist from Mars, the spatial psychology book. Just a thought.
I've no idea. So this patient, if she put her hand behind her head, she would have no idea where it was. Because there is no sensory feedback. Well, the sensory feedback she receives isn't constructed into a representation to process where body parts are. So it's not that she's gone numb, although, you can imagine what it'd be like. She's still got sensation, but it can't be constructed in a meaningful way to place body in three-dimensional space. Now, as a result, she couldn't walk. And she had to learn to walk by looking where her feet were. Because the moment she looks away from the feet, she can feel the sensations and all the rest, but she can't organize that into a meaningful way as to where her feet actually exist. And so she had learned to pay attention visually to where everything is in order to be able to live a relatively functional life. Now, the synchronicity was I was newly qualified as a nurse, and I was working in Southampton on the cardiac unit. And we had the week I was reading that book, we had a patient in who had a stroke and had the same issue. This patient had lost proprioception. And it was fascinating to actually then work with this patient over the course of a couple of days, who was up on the unit, and have the insight from Oliver Sacks' book at the same time. And I brought the book in, and I suggested everyone gets a copy, including the patient, because I think thought it'd be quite useful. So proprioception is the key thing. Now, what we're doing with the metaphors of movement process is a pace and lead, because once the person has proprioceptive access, they're going to start to construct that into a visual way. And so now they'll start to describe, well, what's to the left? Well, it's something coming at me, or it's something blocking my way. And that thing is like what? Or what's, what sort of thing is the thing? If we're using clean language questions, and we can then pull out what that thing is.
But in
and
clean
now they're going
language,
to start
I say the past is to my right. And they would go on with that.
Right. So when you got that, I would call that a boundary violation. So the past is over to this side. Then I would say, well, that's not within the domain of what you've just been talking about. That's a different category of information. And I would explain the concept of boundary violations to that person to bring them back to the elicitation of the metaphor.
Okay. So going back to the clean language bit, from what I sensed, from what I read, from my limited knowledge of clean language, I found it to be more passive from the part of the therapist that's just asking these specific questions, while in metaphors of movement, there's more activeness in getting people to notice things.
I think the distinction I would bring to the differences between metaphors of movement and clean language are slightly different to that. Okay. I wrote a piece, I mean, God, I must have written it about 10 years ago now. What's the difference between metaphors of movement and clean language? And if it's still online, I probably, now I think about it, ought to take that down, because my understanding of what the hell I'm doing is completely different today to what it was 10 years ago. So I'm sorry, I've completely forgotten. I'm still, just for those watching, post-COVID, and quite some significant neurological issues arose from COVID. And one of them is I completely lose track. Normally pivoting on a noun, trying to access the noun I'm trying to get, and then whoosh, the whole thing disappears. So where were we?
Difference between clean language and, I said active and passive, and you said no.
Got it. Thank you. So rather than active and passive, I would argue there are two major differences between clean language and metaphors of movement. One is that clean language is organized around the outcome, okay, which is what would you like to have happen. Mm-hmm. And metaphors of movement is very much based around the beginning, the initiator of the journey, as opposed to the outcome of the journey, because it's largely about movement, so therefore the journey. And so I'm problem focused. Clean language is much more outcome focused. Okay. The other structural difference, and this is the major difference, clean language seeks to avoid content imposition. And for really, really good reasons. Content imposition is a massive problem in any change work, therapy, and psychology, because the therapist is projecting into the experience or their interpretation of their client's experience all their own biases and prejudices and everything else. And you end up with some ridiculous excesses from therapists and coaches. There's a woman who works just up the road here. We share the same office sometimes when I need an office to go and work in. And she's one of these recovered memory therapists who basically, it does not matter what problem you have, you were sexually abused as a child. But I don't remember being abused. I don't think I was. That's because you're both in denial as a result of the massive repression. And that's literally what she does. And she diagnoses everybody as having been abused as a kid. It's unbelievable. If you really want to see that to the extreme, look up the name Valerie Sinison. Valerie Sinison. I'll send you the link over so you can stick it up on the screen if you want to. She's a hugely influential psychologist, and she's really the ruler of the recovered memory therapy movement, where everyone was abused. And she, of course, plays detective as many of these therapists do. So that for me, that's a good example of content imposition gone wrong. Mm-hmm. The other thing that goes wrong, of course, is when therapists, coaches, and all the rest offer interpretation. So they go, okay, so what does that mean? A bit like dream interpretation, where they're interpreting meaning. Now, what we're doing in metaphors of movement is actually, don't bother trying to avoid content imposition, because it's very, very difficult to do. We will utilize it. And so essentially, we're problem focused with a utilization of content imposition as leverage to get the person a greater understanding of their situation. Okay. But what we don't offer is outcome. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it a hard sell. And that's why I think clean language will always be the superior model in the marketplace, so to speak. I don't see them as competing with each other at all. I think they're perfectly compatible. But clean language is the one that has really become very, very popular, and rightly so. I can't, I won't deny that, because it's a very, very good model, and I recommend people learn it. And Lawley and Tompkins with their writings, I mean, my goodness, the amount of stuff they've produced and insight is well worth looking at. A lot of it's on their website. Rather than, because outcome is easy to sell, solution-focused therapy, where, okay, so will I get to feel better? Yes, you will. Then they come to Andy's metaphors of movement. So what's the outcome? You haven't got one. Will it make me feel better? Might do, might not.
Probably not.
Right. So why would anyone want to do that? What's the point? There is no point, because points are about the outcome. We're not about the outcome, we're about the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you do this? Well, you're asking me for an outcome, and I can't answer that because it's about the problem, not the outcome. And so it's a difficult sell to get across to people.
You call it a linguistic forensic tool, which is it's for exploring our own experience rather than getting somewhere with it, like understanding where we are, and then on our own decide where the hell we want to go with it.
Yeah. It's one of the things I recognized when I worked in psychiatry, and also I as working as a therapist as well. And it's the sheer capacity for people to lie and deceive themselves to an extraordinary degree about their situation. And our sort of ego defense mechanisms, which are well documented since the days of Freud, where we're able to kid ourselves and fool ourselves into a different reality than one we have. Now, my observation of psychiatry, that those who are able to accurately assess the reality of their situation and were surrounded by people who were honest rather than hopeful and dishonest, did a lot better. I saw the same thing in general medicine as well, working in hospitals. The kid who comes in horrifically injured and frightened and guarding and doesn't want anyone to come near him, who ends up getting lots and lots of reassurance from grown adults around them, generally doesn't offer up any cooperation. But the kid who's confronted by people going, fucking hell, that is the worst injury I've seen this morning, and that's going to hurt, isn't it? That's got to be the worst thing that's ever happened. That kid now goes, these people understand. And I saw so many examples of that in psychiatry as well, when essentially people were inherently dishonest to their patients. You live here now, you're in your best, we're here for you, we're here to give you it. No, you're not. You're here because you get paid to be. And what you write in the notes isn't as confidential as you'd like to tell your patients, because you hand that around all the other staff. It gets fed back up the chain, and this person's life is subject to what you write in the notes and what you say about them in the meeting. Mm-hmm. And you don't like that patient, and he knows that, and so that's why he's paranoid. No, he's not. He's got a mental disorder. And I have never expressed it. Like, the denial from the staff, the denial from patients was phenomenal. In the environments where staff were inherently honest and actually stated it like it was, the results were far superior. Metaphors of movement is an attempt to recreate that. It's not an attempt. We recreate this connection to reality with a sense of honesty, as opposed to let's focus on outcome, which isn't happening now and is everything that is not currently true.
You translated the thing with the hurt kid into the Hertz bias, that if somebody is having a Hertz bias and they're emotionally hurt, you're not acknowledging and saying that's fine, that's okay. You're just like, that's fucking painful and just sucks to be there. Just by,
because I think one of the things about the human suffering is that it's really important for us to be understood and heard by someone who actually understands and hears, as opposed to how many of us throughout the course of our life have had the experience of trying to communicate to a loved one, to a parent, to someone who's important to us, our suffering, and they think they understand, but we actually 100% know that they haven't got it at all, and we just learn to shut the fuck up. Mm-hmm. What's the point? There's no point in trying to communicate any further. And that is part of the human condition. And how many of those instances do we go throughout the course of our life where we then start just closing it in, shutting it off, denying it from ourselves? There's no point in exploring it. No one understands. And I might as well just deny it to myself and just go and party, do something to distract myself, cheer myself up, have some Prozac, have a glass of wine, go and do some therapy that just further, go and do a feel-good course, millionaire mindset, become a PUA pickup artist, all the shit that people do to cope with life, as opposed to how about let's deal with reality.
Mm-hmm. You call this kinesthetic denial, which is sometimes found in therapy.
Yeah, I think the majority of therapy creates kinesthetic denial. I think so much therapy has got no actual intervention value whatsoever, apart from it facilitates a denial.
The thing I found very interesting after I started taking courses with you and courses with Nick Kemp, which was the thinking process behind coaching and therapy, which was more than just the technique part. Lots of courses I've attended in my life were just, this is the technique, apply it here, you'll get that, which is absolute insanity in many different places because it gets nowhere. What was Frank Farelly's influence on this being in the moment thing for you, at least, just short?
I think I was very, very lucky because the majority of people who discover Frank Farelly have done usually things like Ericksonian therapy and NLP first, and then hear of Frank Farelly. I had it the other way around. I was familiar with Frank Farelly's book. I thought he was long dead. I thought Farelly had probably died back in the 60s. I got his book when I was a student. And it went with me. To cut a very long story short, when I was a student nurse, I had no interest in nursing. I had no interest in any of the studies. There were two booksellers in the city, in Portsmouth, where I lived, who, because all the magic and occult stuff I was into, all the alternative psychology, they used to keep books beside for me. Because every Friday, I go to these two bookshops and buy up a load of books. And in that pile, along with loads of R.D. Laing, I got everything by R.D. Laing. I was getting everything I could by Bateson. Aleister Crowley was another one at the same time. And all this book, Provocative Therapy, came in. And I think it was an influence on me very early on. Because what I saw was you can be very effective with humor. Not mental health, psychotherapy doesn't have to be dull.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the things that Bandler really introduced to the world. And people started, I mean, back in the 90s, people were calling Bandler's stuff stand-up therapy instead of stand-up comedy. And there's no denial, the guy's very effective when he does this stuff. And Frank Farelly has very similar stuff. There's a different model to it. There's a different structure to it. So I think what it did for me actually was more validate a lot of what I did. It didn't necessarily become a thing that I understood, but I felt there was a lot of validation. Roll on a few years, and I discovered that Frank Farelly's doing a workshop just down the road here from where I lived at the time, over in Bournemouth. And I emailed Nick and said, he's alive!
Who says that story?
I thought he was dead, I thought he probably died back years ago. Anyway, so me, Nick, I think Jamie Smart was there as well. There was a few others. There was only 14 of us. And that's the thing I was quite shocked by. 14 people.
And there was almost something, a feminist group also with you.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I so wish they had that on video, because there were two extremely woke individuals. One, I think, was mental, and the other one, I think, was very well intentioned. One of them wasn't at all. She was a maniac. And it was 4 days, and it made for an absolutely amazing experience. The two women, that were a nightmare, I am so glad they were there, because I think it gave Frank a genuine opportunity to deal with someone who is absolutely bonkers and problematic. And so we saw it for real, as opposed to let's all role play. Mm-hmm. So it was a fantastic experience. 14 of us for 4 days meant we got a lot of one-to-one attention from Frank, and a lot of tuition, a lot of questions, and so forth. So then, I mean, that's when Nick then got a relationship with Frank, started hosting him, and it went from there. And I think Frank was relatively unknown up until that point, apart from the references that Bandler would give him when he was teaching NLP.
the trainings in Germany. He has a few trainings in Germany and in Holland, I guess, with the others in Holland. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Frank Farelly's work, and then what Nick developed and presented from there on in, I think is a huge influence, not on the technique and methodology that I work, but in the styling of how it's delivered.
The gesture.
Yeah, and I think, and for those who are familiar with the archetypes, for me, it's very much in the Hod on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and the trickster archetype, very much within that domain. And it makes perfect sense to me. And the ancients, I mean, they group together basically humor, comedy with communication, science, and medicine. They put those into very much the same archetypal categories. And I think for good reason. But modern day therapy, in its need to be regarded as professional and science and a branch of medicine, dropped humor.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, if you dress like a clown, behave like a clown, don't take yourself too seriously, often you won't be regarded as something that would be acceptable in a professional environment.
Okay.
So I think an awful lot of the stoicism that goes with therapy is inherited from the days of it trying to become a branch of medicine.
Mm. Okay. And then I'm curious about, did you meet Charles Faulkner first, or was it Steve Andreas first? Because you were massively influenced by Charles Faulkner's work for the metaphors part, and Steve was kind of like can I say a mentor who supported you for a long period of time?
I think, no, do you know, I don't remember. I think I probably met Charles before. I don't know. Yeah, I must have met Charles before I met Steve. I think, I don't know. A lot happened in the space of just a handful of years. An awful lot happened in terms of me being an unknown entity who was largely regarded as a troll online, a troublemaker, a nuisance, and a public embarrassment by lots of people. Some of my ideas, I was beginning they were beginning to coalesce, and I got recognized for some of those ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think the connection with Steve and Connie Ray, and then with Charles, it kind of went out from there, and everything changed for me. Two things happened. I started getting lots and lots of recognition from people, and lots of threats of litigation, and they all happened at the same time. It was quite a bizarre. I thought, oh, hang on, I am getting noticed. Yeah.
So from Charles' work, you said you attended several trainings, and then did it make sense at first, and then something clicked?
Yeah, it wasn't any full trainings. To cut a long story short, I invited Charles to come and speak at my NLP group, which at the time then, I think I was running it at Chichester University, renting rooms in the university. And I think we probably had about 8 or 9 people. So when Charles came, I thought, oh, this would be quite a good marketing coup. We have lots and lots of people, and I think we got a whole 12 turn up. Again, which was great for us. I got to spend pretty much the better part of the day with Charles. He did the presentation, and I was bamboozled. I then saw him do the same presentation again just up the road to another practice group, either the same week or the following week. And then I went to another one, where was that? I can't remember, it might have been London or somewhere. Anyway, I saw him do the same presentation 3 times.
Was it words within a word, or something around this type of word?
Yeah. But what fascinated me about it is I genuinely didn't understand a word of it. Mm-hmm. And hanging out with Charles, outside of that context, only twice. I only hang out with him twice. So I wouldn't like to portray, yes, me and Charles are best friends. We've known each other for years. We're best buddies. No. It's a fairly superficial, relationship in that respect. It's the emails backwards and forwards. Because I was so bamboozled, that really caught my attention, because in the time I spent with Charles, he's clearly a very clever guy, very articulate, and he knows a lot of stuff. So I kind of made it my mission to get my head around what the hell he was talking about. Now I look back and I think, crikey, this is why I used to call it shouting at the deaf. It was like I had been deaf to a whole section of human communication that everyone had been communicating very, very clearly all these years, and I'd never noticed. Never noticed it at all. And it was in my attempts to understand. The same year, I started to get unwell. And this was the other thing that, again, a whole lot of stuff happened simultaneously. So I then developed the condition that I now live with. But it meant I had a remarkable amount of free time because I wasn't necessarily able to work a lot of the time. So I was able to start making notes, reading, studying, and doing all that kind of stuff to try and work out what the hell this was all about. And that's when I was already into metaphor, but I didn't have some distinctions that made the difference for me. And that's what I got from Charles. And then the rest really developed over time.
And from that bit, he mentioned the acting and improv thing, and you also added that to your experience.
Yeah, as we were on the train, Charles was heading up to London, and I was on the train heading back home. For life of me, I can't remember where we had been or whatever. But as I went to get off the train, or he went to get off the train, I forget which way around it was now. He said, "Yeah," and John Grinder said to me, "If you want to know more, you better go and learn acting." And that was his last. Yeah, see ya, and that was it. And I thought there's a message there. So I did. I went and learned in acting, took some improv classes, and I did learn a hell of a lot, actually, that I had completely missed before.
Going to Steve Andreas, was it the IEMT, EMI thing, or what was the connection that got you to work with Steve for a while?
OCD.
OCD.
I had again, cut long story short. So back in the 90s, I had one of the first NLP websites when you still had dial-up. Some people were still getting a phone and putting their handset onto a device. Mm-hmm. I had a modem that was 56K. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, and you just like, crikey, you just try and download a clip of something. It was taking an hour to do. Mm-hmm. I had a website that I put up very early on. I had another site, didn't go very far, 23 NLP people. I was putting up my NLP stuff and neurology stuff. Mm-hmm. Two things happened with that website. The band Tool, I had never heard of them, and it was actually only in recent years I've ever heard their music. It was through Spotify I heard their music. Never heard them before. Don't like them, to be honest. Not my style of stuff. But people kept saying to me, "You should listen to Tool because I think you resonate with them." And clearly what I was writing at the time resonated with them, because on one of their, either blogs weren't a thing back then, so on one of their fan pages, when the fan sites were started, one of the Tool members, Justin, the English guy, mentioned my website. And holy shit, I've never seen anything like it. The hit counter on, because it was a rudimentary hit count, it just went nuts, and the website kept going offline, not enough bandwidth. As a result of that, then somebody in a drive time show, the American equivalent of the car show, whatever, mm-hmm. Mentioned the website too. I don't know why. I never saw it, but I got somebody emailed me to say, "You've just been mentioned on this TV show in the States." And the website crashed for pretty much on and off for a week, as so many people were looking at it. So that kind of raised my profile. Time then moves on, because now people know the site, and I'm number one for pretty much all the NLP search terms, mm-hmm. because there weren't many websites back then. There wasn't a lot online. It was before the days that everyone had a website. Steve emailed me to ask me a question about OCD. And I was amazed. I mean, Steve Andreas, I've read all his books. I mean, I've seen him on video. I was like, oh my God, he's like the God has messaged me. So I wrote a short reply, and then I thought about it, and I thought, actually, I've got more to say. And it's Steve after all. So my little reply grew to a bigger one, and then the next day it got bigger, and then I sent it. Conversation then takes place backwards and forwards about this OCD patient. I then developed that into a full-blown article. And Steve said, you should write more of these. And so I did. He then started, I mean, it's a long process of writing these pieces. They then got edited together to become the Rainbow Machine. So that's how that book then was developed. And that happened over years. That wasn't a straight off process. And there was a lot of stuff that I was writing that was just nonsense. So that was saying, not publishing that. Okay. So that was how that happened.
What was different about him that he knew, I'm going to say, not spot talents, but he used to support people to develop things? Like, I know he had an influence on you, he had an influence on Nick, he had an influence on Richard Bolstad, he had an influence on Lucas Dirks. So he had...
Well, Steve had a rare quality in NLP, and in the NLP comprehensive scene. So that was Stephen Connie Ray, Charles Faulkner,
Tom Best.
a whole load of other people. I'll go amnesic as I try to remember names. So I'm not gonna go there. A good range of people. What they all shared was something that's actually very rare in the NLP world, which is they want other people to do well.
Mm-hmm.
Most NLPers that I come across only want themselves to do well, and they see everyone else doing well as a threat to them. Whereas all of this scene, this crew, whatever the word is, this group of people within NLP Comprehensive, they're there to facilitate other people to do well.
Mm.
And they all share that ethos, and it's quite a remarkable thing, and it's a wonderful thing. Whereas other sectors within the NLP community, it's all me, and what's in it for me. And I think that's the difference. And Steve facilitated so many people. And I think had he not have really picked up on what I was doing, I'd probably still be the same person that I used to be. Thank God I'm not.
Okay. So you mentioned during the IEMT trainings that it started from you were attending something related to EMDR, somebody was working on a client, and then you switched the machine, and then from there you noticed something was different, or how did that start?
Right, so the IEMT work developed from, I had awareness of EMDR. I was aware of that, and I started playing with the notion of eye movements, but I didn't know what I was doing. But there was something I began to recognize with people. I was living literally in the city center of Southampton. I was in a basement flat. We called it the bunker, right in the heart of the city. So it's very hard to be lonely and alone. So I had plenty of people to practice with. And because I was known for what I was doing, I worked in a hospital as well. I had no shortage of volunteers and people with problems wanting help. So I was able to test lots of stuff. I recognized that EMDR works brilliantly on memories. It doesn't work so well on things projected, so future-based events. So they're anxious about a meeting tomorrow. Wiggling the eyes as much as like make no difference. Mm-hmm. But past events, it often made a tremendous difference. Okay, so that's interesting to me. Now, I was working in the brain surgery department at the time at Southampton General Hospital. And there's a number of things happened all around about the same time. So the sequence and order may be incorrect here. But one of the things, because of the way the eyes work, the eyes converge in this axis, and this axis. And for those familiar with the neuroanatomy, you've got the optic chiasma. So the big nerves coming off the eye, going to the visual cortex at the back, they cross over. Mm-hmm. And that crossover is the optic chiasma. Now, when people have a brain tumor or a space-occupying lesion in the brain, it can displace that. Now, one of the effects that can have is you get a deviance in either this, or this. So things don't quite line up. And so it gives the doctors a really good indication as to where something is, how big it is, and so forth. And they would do that by having a patient lie flat on the back and wave a pen around. And they watch for the deviances and how the eyes are converging. I saw a funny little movement happen. And I said, right, this is what we then called an axis, or I then called an axis deviation in IEMT. I said to the doc, what is that? And he said, oh, it's nothing. It's just an artifact. I thought, okay, that's just nothing, meaning it's not relevant to the process. On another patient, I saw the same thing happen again. And I said to the patient, what just happened? And the patient apologized. He said, I'm sorry, I just drifted off for a moment. And I thought, ooh. So I thought, is this a correlation between a funny little eye movement and the person changing their mind? Something has just changed. They were paying attention to the situation at hand, the doctor doing an assessment, and for a moment they went somewhere else. And I could see that happen. Bingo. I phoned my mum that day. I mean, she probably still remembers. Mum, I've discovered something. This is going to change everything. Yeah, okay, that's nice, dear. And I couldn't believe it. So that was one of the things that happened. simultaneously, because I lived opposite the psychiatric unit, and I used to go over there quite a lot for lunch because I staff badge, discounted food. I also used to work there on the odd occasion. I had various things I would do. So certain consultants would run late night operations to clear a backlist, and they would need someone to go and do the recovery of those patients in the evenings. Because I lived opposite, I could say, well, if you need someone for 2 hours, I'm happy to nip over, get paid for it. It works for me, easy work. And so I used to do that. I got to know a lot of the staff in the psychiatric unit of that small hospital. Now, as a result, I was able to get access into the psychiatric services as an observer. And so I tried to get admitted for 2 weeks on the acute unit. I wanted them to allow me to live in the unit amongst the patient group. They wouldn't let me do that, but they said, you can come in, and stay for as long as you want, but we can't actually have you being resident here. Okay, fine. So I spent 2 weeks over there. As a result of that, I got to know people. And one of the things was I was allowed into the psychiatrist appointment clinic. So he was doing one-to-ones with people. And one of the things they were doing was EMDR. Mm-hmm. And basically, cut long story short, I interfered with something. And something happened that then taught me something about how the eyes move. It got me in a load of trouble as well. I was then banished from that department forever. And essentially it gave me the basis of what became IEMT.
And then through IEMT, there was something that happened that got you into the metaphor work also, which was the identity bit.
Right. So then along the development of IEMT, I'm then calling it eye movement integration. And bizarrely, I mean, ridiculous. I thought I'd come up with that term myself. And of course I hadn't. And around about that time, of course, I've actually been sent that training stuff by Connie Ray. And it's all, looking back, I wasn't paying attention to a lot of stuff I should have been paying attention to. So a lot of influence is coming in from different areas. As the work started to develop, and I then got into the identity aspects that we could use these eye movements with, I discovered that I'm using far less of the eye movements and far more metaphor. And in the advanced trainings that I was offering, I realized that actually we're not doing any eye movements anymore. And I'm offering this as advanced IEMT, but there's no eye movements and people are questioning this. So I thought, right, let's separate these two things out. Around about that time, I then meet Charles. There's so many things happening simultaneously. It's hard to actually tease them out into a sequence or order. I then separate the two models out. So then the metaphors becomes the metaphor work, and then we've got the IEMT. It was only then when I presented the rudimentary stuff that I had over in Colorado, which was when the first time I met Steve and Connie Ray. Steve referred to it in a blog post that I was teaching metaphors of movement as a descriptor, not as a title. And really, without being desperate for a name for what I was doing, I grabbed that name and called it Metaphors of Movement. Not knowing that Charles already had that as the name for. So yeah,
it's a title of
things I should have paid attention
to. Words within words. I think it's the second video.
Yeah, and brilliantly, of course, I was quite relieved when Steve said, "Oh yeah," I didn't know that either. I was like, "Thank God for that! It's not just me." So I was quite relieved when Steve said that. So as I say, there's knowing what I know now. There's lots of stuff looking back I should have and would prefer to have done differently, but no time machine. So
yeah. I'm going to jump to something that's related to the patterns of chronicity. Lots of people who learn the IEMT stuff, it's from my perspective, at least, I sometimes tend to jump to it as a diagnosis way. It's not a diagnosis. And it's more of, so how can it be more easily spotted? When you did this, you worked with a bunch of people that had chronic issues and you saw these patterns. If somebody is like starting off with the IEMT stuff and wants to spot the 5 major patterns of chronicity, what's the main thing to keep in mind to spot them and not start diagnosing them?
Right. So it is a problem. Therapists who even say, well, I don't believe in diagnosing people, I don't put people in boxes. They probably are diagnosing people. They're just using different words. And it is a problem. And I would urge people not to do that. Now, for those who are familiar with what these 5 patterns of chronicity are, so there'll be people who've done the IEMT training, what I would suggest is this: rather than be looking for it in people, suppose we take the being at effect, not being a cause. Generate 100 examples of how you could present that behavior. What is the languaging of that pattern? Find 100 examples of the languaging of that pattern. What form would it take? How could it be communicated directly, indirectly, in every other way? And so essentially take each of the patterns.
For example, the depression is ruining my life, for example.
Right. And now, of course, now you can look at the cause and effect relationship of that and the active and passive, then break it down even further. So essentially, rather than be looking for it in people, find as many ways it can be presented and generated. Then what I recommend, YouTube is a fantastic resource for this, particularly those exploitation TV shows. We used to have lots of them in the UK, but because people kept dying as a result of being on those shows, they don't do them anymore, which is like the daytime chat show where people with problems or families with problems come on in front of an audience to basically fight with each other and abuse one another and then be berated by the presenter or humiliated in some way as a way of, but we're helping you. There's lots and lots of videos like that online. And then what I recommend is once people have generated hundreds of each of these examples, then go through those video clips, transcribe them, get a 4 or 5 minute clip, do a transcription of it, and then do a linguistic analysis on that. Look. I don't know if you're still there.
I'm still here.
Are you still there, Ronnie?
Cut off for a second.
Oh.
Unstable. Okay. So you were saying do a transcription of the 4 or 5 minute video and then everything froze.
Yeah, and that I think one of the frustrations I have, and I talk about this a lot when I'm training, and it's probably when I probably ought to not go on about quite so much. But basically, coaches and therapists are really lazy. People have no concept of how much work it takes. If people want to turn up on a course, have a great time, get a certificate at the end, and be an expert, they have no idea of the hours and hours that I spend, and people I know, people like Nick spend. Steve used to be the same. I used to be like, Steve, do you ever sleep? Because he spends hours working through stuff. He spent hours, analyzing things. And most coaches and therapists don't. They just do a course. And that's it. And their knowledge is so superficial, it's cringeworthy. And I get caught with their YouTube presentations or websites because, I don't want to knock people for having a go, but at the same time, I do want people to do better.
When you were back on Facebook, I used to remember the Facebook groups where people asked questions and then you would throw these comments here and there.
It's like, what is, but then they call themselves, it's like, give myself a grandiose title. I'm a master coach. And some people go, yes, I am Andy, your master coach. Oh, fuck off. Stop being so pretentious and put some work into your knowledge level. And so that's the thing I urge people to do is actually, the notion is very much, if it feels like hard work, you're doing it wrong. That seems to be the ethos that people operate under, because they used to say that, no, if it feels like hard work, it is, because it is, and you probably need to do more than that. And people aren't willing to do so, because I think most people become a coach to avoid the pain of work, not to do more pain of work,
Yeah, well, there's lots of experimentation. I've noticed that from what you do, like in the fast phobia model without words, which was just a competition you guys had in your NLP group, and you just came up with that. What's your thinking process around this? I recently watched the 6-step reframe video, and I'm loving the analysis of the usefulness of things and the context where things are used compared with other stuff. Like, this is a technique applied anywhere. Is this over a period of years? Is it just you choose what you want to experiment, or how do you think about this when you want to discover the usefulness of things?
I think there's only one difference. Well, apart from their hard work, apart from the mind-boggling amount of effort and cost. You see, I would say 90% of what I do doesn't earn me any money.
Mm.
The reason I know what I know is because of the amount of effort I put into the testing of everything. So for example, the thing I'm doing now with ARFID, so basically selective eating disorder, I put so much into that, mostly last year, that I've got a lot of data. I've now got to field test it. So it'll be another year yet to field test that. I'm not getting paid for any of that stuff whatsoever. It earns me no money, but there's a lot of cost involved. When I send a lot of stuff off, I film everything, send it off for transcript. That cost, there's a cost element to that. A lot of these, it's too many hours to transcribe for myself. So that's one key thing. The other one is when I work with a client or do any change work with a person, I don't need to believe it worked. I dropped that years ago. I want to know if it did work, and if it doesn't, tell me what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think coaches have a certain ego need, which is because it's quite a personal thing. When you're coaching, when you're therapizing, we're putting ourselves into it. And it's almost immediately now that the therapist and coach is biased to believing what they're doing is brilliant.
Mm.
I don't. I want to find out if it's effective, and if not, why not? And if it is, why? And I'm constantly looking to refine stuff. So, okay, so I spent an hour talking to a person, but only 5 minutes of it was useful. Okay, what 5 minutes of it was useful? What wasn't? And now I have to reanalyze, okay, was I just indulging myself here, or was I down the wrong path entirely? What was going on? Or is there something else happening there? So it's abandoning the need to be successful. And so many coaches, therapists, and all the rest of it are constantly portraying how successful they are. Oh, just stop it, people. Stop it. You want to be effective. Don't want to be successful. If you want to be successful, it's easier to go and get a day job and do well at that.
It's in the marketing, though. It's in the marketing and the YouTube videos and how they sell the courses. And it's like, I train NLP, certified trainer of NLP, but from what I do, and I've been changing that throughout the years, it's like, this is a toolbox that you can apply in your current job. This is not about being a coach. This is not about becoming the best version of yourself. It's just about learning some skills that might or might not improve your life if you actually use them in the right context. And even though in these trainings, like, I still get people who say, I have this client coming next week that has such and such. What do I use? And there's the missing like awareness of, okay, so what Nick says, what's creating and maintaining the problem? What are the ingredients of this? Which is completely missed out. So
yeah. I think the other thing is there's a very much a feel-good Pollyanna mentality, which is there aren't any real problems in the world. You only have problems if you believe you have. And there is this, and I think because of,
I mean, we live in Lebanon, we have every single problem that might exist is here, but the amount of
they're just in your mind.
Yeah,
law of attraction. Yeah. And so unfortunately, there are lots and lots of coaches and therapists, and I think possibly the majority, who actually have that mentality of, there are any problems. And if you put your mind to it, you can be anything, do anything, change anything. And I think because largely they're coming from upper middle class backgrounds, they've come from a corporate environment, they've had a safe life, they're living in a nice middle class suburban environment. And, they've never really had much go wrong in their lives. And then they give you their story, because they all love to give you the story. How I got into NLP. Well, I was really unhappy in my previous work and I didn't like school. And, I used to drink too much. Oh, for fuck's sake, who cares? You know, that's not the same as having your leg blown off by an IED. It's not the same as having your whole family murdered or killed in an accident when the house burned down and you were made redundant the following day. So I mean, and yet somehow, because, oh, I used to be unhappy in my work, and that means I'm special. Oh, fuck off. I mean, seriously, that's the level of reality. Well, that's you know, that's what they think. Oh, I shan't go on my rant. Yeah. I think there's an issue of problem relativism. So you can't judge another person's problems by your own because everything is relative. Really? Is this why we have a generation of people growing up who are so unbelievably naive and easily manipulated? Because they have no capacity to form a judgment. Because to judge something now goes against the progressive political ideologies. And so we have, unfortunately, more people entering into adulthood who have this notion of relativity, whether it's cultural relativity, racial relativity, religious relativity, suffering relativity, and that we mustn't judge anybody. And you can be anything you want to be. You can even change gender and race if you wish, because you just have to put trans in front of it and call everyone else cis. So, oh, that is the it's like, yeah. And then meanwhile, there's some real problems in the world that real people are suffering really badly. But you know, let's protest the pronouns. No, I'm at risk of going off in tangential ranting here. Rein it back in, Austin.
So that's it from my side. I really want to thank you for your time, for all of this chat.
And thank you, Roni.